Dawn's pale, trembling light crept over the dusty streets of Redstone Flats, illuminating a town steeped in hardship and rumor. In the center of the weathered wooden square, its boards cracked by years under the relentless sun, a grim spectacle had been set. Mara, a slight yet determined woman with sorrow etched into every line of her scarred face, stood on a crude scaffold. Around her, a heavy rope dangled ominously, a brutal instrument of frontier justice. She had been falsely accused of theft, a crime concocted by a corrupt official whose cruelty spared no expense in punishing the innocent. Now, with the sentence of hanging at dawn sealed for her, Mara's eyes shone with quiet defiance and unshed tears. The air, heavy with dust and despair, carried murmurs from the gathered townsfolk, voices that spoke both in pity and in harsh judgment. "Justice here is a rope with no mercy," muttered an old man from back, his tone laden with sorrow. As the clock's slow tick underscored the oppressive silence, the once familiar square transformed into a stage for retribution. Men and women clustered in uneasy groups, their faces marked by grief and resignation. No one dared meet Mara's gaze directly, as if by looking too closely, they might confirm the terrible truth. The sheriff's words had been cold and final. She would be hanged at dawn. Yet even as the people surrendered to fate's cruelty, Mara's heart whispered rebellion, a secret hope that refused to die even when the hands of destiny seemed to grasp her neck. In that charged, desperate moment, the sound of pounding hooves shattered the oppressive stillness. Out of the swirling red dust on the horizon emerged a solitary rider, a dark silhouette against the newborn light. The thundering echoes grew, drawing nearer with each powerful stride, a hefty, sure-footed stallion. All eyes in the square turned as the rider neared, and whispers turned to gasps. The man was none other than Silas Crowe, a gunslinger renowned across the frontier for his lethal skill and iron will. Draped in a long duster and his hat's shadowing eyes that burned with a cold, unyielding fire, he rode like a force of nature. His reputation was fearsome. Men whisper his name as if it carried the weight of death itself. Yet behind that fearsome exterior, if one cared to look, there glimmered something unexpectedly compassionate. Silas dismounted with a grace that belied the harshness of his life on the dusty trails. His heavy boot struck the wooden planks of the square, each step a defiant declaration against the tyranny of injustice. With a voice that rang out, firm yet imbued with a hint of mercy, he cried, "Hold! I claim this condemned woman as my bride." The words, charged with both audacity and an unspoken promise of redemption, burst into the silence like a shot of pure lightning. The assembled crowd recoiled in shock and disbelief, a murmur of astonishment rising as they struggled to comprehend the shocking turn of events. For a suspended heartbeat, the world seemed to hang between the oppressive law of the town and the wild promise of defiance. Mara's gaze, once fixed on a void of certain death, flickered with new and uncertain hope as Silas strode purposefully toward the scaffold. "This is no place for the innocent," Silas declared, his eyes locking onto the sheriff and daring him to speak further. "Let it be known that I will not allow tyranny to silence a soul who bears no guilt. I stand in her stead as protector and husband, and no man here shall drag her to her fate." His words, bold and laced with quiet fury, shattered the grim ritual that had been set in motion. In that electrifying moment, the balance of power began to shift. The sheriff, a man who had prided himself on commanding respect through fear, faltered under the weight of Silas's conviction. The murmurs of the crowd swelled into a chorus of disbelief and hope. Some faces, creased by a lifetime of hardship, softened as they beheld the gunslinger's unlikely intervention. Even as the harsh wind stirred the dust around them, a fragile promise of change took root. Without ceremony, Silas extended a calloused hand toward Mara. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of terror, uncertainty, and a dawning sense of possibility, hesitated only a moment before she reached out. Their connection, instantaneous and heavy with meaning, sealed a pact unspoken yet profound. Silas mounted his horse once more, and Mara clutched his hand as they turned away from the scaffold. In that act of bold defiance, They shattered the cruel design laid out for her. The angry shouts of outraged townsfolk and the clamor of pursuing men echoed in the background as the pair rode off together into vast, untamed wilderness of the wild plains. The sound of pursuing riders, distant yet insistent, gradually faded against the roar of wind and the beating of a hopeful heart. As the duo rode further from Redstone Flats, the oppressive heat of the town gave way to the cool, expansive serenity of the open country. Silas glanced at Mara, his gaze softening as he spoke in a low, earnest tone. Justice here is not defined by the rope that binds you, but by the courage you show in facing life's harsh truths. His words, tender and resolute, ignited something deep within her, a spark of defiance and promise that glowed against the backdrop of a broken world. In the distance, the cries of pursuers mingled with the whisper of the wind, a reminder that danger still lurked in the shadows of her past. Yet in that moment, riding side by side with a man who embodied both fear and salvation, Mara felt a stirring of hope. Perhaps her story was not destined to end in the dim light of an unjust dawn, but to begin anew under the endless sky of the frontier. As the wild plains rolled before them, a canvas of arid earth and sparse, resilient life, Mara's heart flared with the possibility of redemption. Though the specter of her condemned fate loomed behind, it was slowly eclipsed by the promise of a new path, one forged in defiance and tempered by a love as fierce as the untamed land. And as Silas rode on, the distant echoes of angry shouts faded like a dying storm, leaving behind the uncertain promise of freedom and the unspoken vow that, together, they would face whatever trials the horizon might hold. Silas Crowe and Mara rode in silence under a vast, scorching sky. After their daring escape from Redstone Flats, they sought refuge in a remote desert outcrop, a barren plateau where the earth was cracked like ancient leather and brittle shrubs clung desperately to life. The outcrop, isolated and unyielding, offered little more than a meager shade from the relentless sun and a quiet vantage from which to survey the endless expanse. Here, away from the prying eyes of corrupt town and the pursuing riders burning in the distance, Silas and Mara allowed themselves a moment of weary respite. The endless desert stretched in every direction, its parched surface a tattered tapestry of cracked earth and scattered vegetation, whispering secrets of isolation and fragile hope. Seated atop a flat, sun-baked rock, Silas kept vigilant watch while Mara tried to collect her scattered thoughts. Her heart still pounded from the ordeal and the memory of the condemned crowd. The cold dread of an unjust fate lingered like a bitter aftertaste. Her scarred face, a testament to past agonies, reflected suffering intertwined with quiet strength, as if each line told a secret of survival. In the cool, sparse shadows cast by the outcrop, Mara's voice trembled when she began to recount fragments of her troubled history. She spoke softly of a corrupt rancher from a neighboring settlement who had coveted her family's fertile land. When her family had resisted his lecherous advances, he had contrived a charge of theft to ruin them, leaving Mara not only blamed but also bearing scars as harsh reminders of that dark day. Each word fell slowly, as though she were unwrapping long-buried wounds that had festered in silence for years. In the searing heat, Silas remained silent, his gaze fixed upon the distant horizon where mirages danced. Yet, beneath his stoic exterior lay memories of loss and regret that he had carried like unwanted freight. He recalled a day long past when he had failed to save someone dear, an experience that had haunted him through endless rides on unforgiving trails, hardening his resolve to shield the innocent from the cruelty of fate. After a long pause, he finally spoke in a measured tone, low and steady as the distant rumble of an approaching storm. "Mara," he said quietly, "we carry the marks of our past like scars on this endless plain. But remember, the past scars us, but it doesn't own us." His words, simple yet profound, lingered in the dry air, weaving a fragile thread of trust between them. Under the relentless glare of the high sun, the duo sat quietly in the scant shadow offered by a slight rise in the cracked earth. Mara, her eyes clouded with mingled anguish and the faintest glimmer of hope, took a small sip from a worn leather waterskin that Silas had provided. Each sip tasted of survival and the bitter tang of memories. For a long while, They remained silent, each lost in the vast solitude of the desert and in the unspoken bond that was slowly forming between two wounded souls. The world around them was austere yet strangely beautiful. Scattered sagebrush, distant mountains blurred by a shimmering heat haze, and the constant whisper of wind that carried tales of hardship and endurance. In that quiet interlude, the barren land seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for them to decide what kind of future they might forge from its unforgiving expanse. Mara looked up at Silas, her voice soft and filled with a tentative mournfulness. "I was once whole, you know," she confided, her gaze fixed on the distant, shimmering line where earth met sky. "My family owned land, and I had a future that shined bright. But that all changed when a corrupt rancher, greedy for power and wealth, framed me for a crime I did not commit, to seize our land for himself. In that cruel betrayal, I not only lost my home, but also the chance to live freely. These scars," she touched her cheek gently, "they are not merely marks of pain. They remind me of all I've endured and of what I must leave behind." Her voice quavered as each word carried years of solitude and suffering. Silas regarded Mara with a steady, empathetic gaze. He paused, then in a voice barely above a whisper, he admitted, "There was a day when I lost someone dear. I was too late, and I failed to save her from the cruelty of fate. Since then, I've roamed these lands, haunted by that memory and driven by a promise to protect those who suffer injustice. I see in you not only the pain of the past, but the resilience to overcome it. I promise you, Mara, I will not let the shadows of what was claim your future." His confession, laced with quiet sorrow and determination, slowly eased the tension between them and began to knit an unspoken understanding. As the day wore on and the relentless heat turned the desert into a shimmering furnace, the pair found solace in minimal comforts. They shared a small ration of water, its coolness a temporary relief amidst the scorch, and quietly watched the horizon where the sky met the cracked earth. In these moments, their shared silence was filled with a gentle pulse of hope, a promise that together they could build a future, however uncertain, free from the injustices that had marred their lives. Mara closed her eyes as she repeated softly to herself, "The past scars us, but it doesn't own us." That mantra resounded with every beat of her bruised heart, emboldening her spirit even as the memories of betrayal tried to resurface. Then, as the afternoon waned into a languid heat, a sudden, faint sound of hooves broke the stillness. At first, it was little more than a whisper losing itself in the endless breeze, but gradually the sound swelled in intensity. Mara's eyes widened in alarm, and she tensed as the distant clatter threatened to shatter their fragile sanctuary. Silas immediately reached for the pistol at his side, his posture rigid with vigilance. Through the shimmering air, the shadow of approaching riders materialized, their forms blurred by the desert heat yet unmistakably hostile. Every instinct screamed that danger was drawing near. The sound of hooves blended with the sighing wind, forming a dreadful chorus that foretold inevitable confrontation. In that charged moment, with the oppressive heat and the weight of their haunted past pressing in around them, Mara clutched Silas's arm. Her eyes, full of fear yet sparked with defiant hope, met his steady gaze. "Hold on," she whispered urgently. "We will face whatever comes together." Silas nodded silently, his expression unreadable and firm. As the approaching riders drew closer, a dust cloud began to rise on the horizon, a stark reminder that the past, with its painful accusations and relentless pursuit of injustice, was not finished with them yet. With that, the sound of hooves reached a crescendo, leaving the fate of their fragile sanctuary hanging in the balance. Trouble looms. The relentless wind whipped across the open plains, transforming the landscape into a churning sea of dust and desolation. Silas Crowe and Mara pushed their horses onward, leaving behind the safety of the desert outcrop for the vast, exposed territory. The swirling storm of fine, gritty particles blurred the horizon into a shifting mirage. Visibility dwindled to mere yards, and a howling wind drowned out all but the most urgent sounds. In that harsh, unforgiving environment, every step was a battle against nature itself. Silas rode at a measured pace. His eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his worn hat as he scanned the shifting sands. Mara, seated beside him, clutched the reins tightly, her heart pounding with equal parts terror and burgeoning determination. The dust storm rose in intensity, the sun obscured by a thick, turbulent cloud of grit. It was as if the very air rebelled against them, seeking to erase their identities from the endless expanse. Yet amid the chaos, Silas's presence radiated calm and experience, a beacon in a world reduced to swirling oblivion. As they rounded a low rise, the abrupt sound of approaching hooves emerged from the tempest. At first, it was a faint, irregular murmur, barely distinguishable from the gusts of wind. But within moments, it grew louder and more persistent. Men riding hard, their horses stirring up more dust as they charged across the barren plain. Silas's grip tightened on the reins, and his gaze sharpened. In that instant, he realized that their pursuers were drawing near. Their intent was unmistakable: to hunt them down and claim Mara for the false crimes of her past. In the midst of the storm, Silas formulated his plan with the precision of a seasoned tactician. "Mara," he called softly, his voice barely rising above the roar of wind, "we'll need to create a diversion. Trust me and follow my lead." His tone was steady, a quiet command that left no room for hesitation. Mara nodded, swallowing a lump of fear as she met his resolute eyes. She understood that survival now depended on her willingness to take a stand and assist a man who had risked everything for her. Together, they veered their horses sharply off the main trail, entering a narrow corridor of the plains defined by low, barren ridges. The wind's fury seemed to intensify here, carrying swirling eddies of dust that obscured the ground like a veil. Silas dismounted briefly, lowering his horse to the uneven surface. Reaching into the saddlebag, he retrieved a spare duster, a threadbare coat that had seen many battles. With deliberate care, he tore a strip from it and then secured it around a bundle of withered brush he had gathered from the parched earth. "This," he murmured, "will serve as our decoy trail." He draped the contrived bundle along a narrow track, heavy enough to withstand the storm, then patted it down until it lay as naturally as dry foliage could. It was a clever ruse. As the pursuers advanced, they would follow the false trail, lured away from our true path. Mara's eyes widened as she observed Silas's deft handiwork. Although the plan was born of desperate necessity, it exhibited the kind of resourcefulness that filled her with renewed hope. "I see," she whispered, her voice trailing off as she began to appreciate the subtle intricacies of frontier survival. Steeling herself, she scanned the horizon. The storm-swirling veil made it nearly impossible to discern shapes, yet the distant rumble of hooves, mingled with the sound of anxious voices, confirmed that the pursuers were falling for the diversion. Silas remounted his horse and nudged Mara gently. "Keep watch," he instructed firmly. "When you see them splitting from the decoy, ride hard and join me on the other side of the storm. I'll cover our retreat." His eyes, dark and resolute, met hers for a fleeting moment, a silent promise that he would not let her fall. Mara's response came in the form of a determined nod, her features set as if for the first time she were ready to reclaim her own destiny. The wind howled as a dust storm swirled in dizzying patterns, obscuring the land and the men chasing them. The decoy, although rudimentary, began to attract the attention of the pursuing riders. A chorus of urgent shouts and clattering of hooves echoed faintly through the tumult, diverted now from the true path. In the chaotic interlude, Silas urged Mara to steer her horse along a hidden contour through the tall, wind-blown grasses and rocky foothills that dotted the plains. The two riders moved swiftly into a labyrinth of natural cover, where footing was unstable and every step required careful calculation. For a tense, interminable moment, silence reigned over their new trail, punctured only by the howling wind and the muted gallop of distant steeds. Mara's heart pounded in her ears as she kept vigilant watch for any sign of the pursuers. The storm, with all its maddening energy, had become both a shroud and a savior in that murky twilight of swirling sand and blood-red light. The two fugitives relied on each other's strength. Every shared glance and whispered word deepened the trust that was budding between them, a bond forged in the crucible of survival. As the minutes stretched and the tumult of the decoy trail faded into the background, Silas finally signaled that it was safe to move forward. With renewed determination, they pressed onward, their silhouettes merging with the distorted landscape of shifting dunes and rugged terrain. Mara felt an unfamiliar surge of confidence bubble within her, a spark of defiance that whispered that she was no longer the broken woman condemned at dawn, but a survivor, equal to the harshness of this barren land. Yet even as they made progress in the deceptive calm, a new sound slithered to the wind, a faint, insistent clatter that did not blend with the storm's usual cacophony. Mara tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for the small pistol concealed at her side. Silas's eyes narrowed as his every sense sharpened. They paused at the crest of a low ridge, peering into the maw of the tempest. Through the swirling haze, the shapes of riders began to form, a skeletal remnant of the posse that had pursued them. Their clamor was imperceptible at first, only a dissonant murmur carried on the bitter gusts of wind. "Stay close," Silas murmured lowly, not daring to break the fragile silence that now reigned over their precarious refuge. Mara's pulse quickened as she peered into the distance, where the dust had momentarily settled to reveal faint, moving silhouettes. The tension in the air became palpable. It was as though the very elements stilled in anticipation of the next move. In that charged moment, as Mara and Silas braced themselves for what might come next, a single gunshot shattered the heavy silence. It boomed faintly yet unmistakably across the plains, reverberating off the distant hills like a death knell. The sound, abrupt and final, sent a jolt of terror through their veins. Mara's eyes widened in shock, while Silas's hand went to his holster with lightning-quick reflexes. The echo of the gunshot melded with the howling wind, a sinister reminder that danger had not yet abandoned them. As the dust storm continued to rage and the horizon swirled with restless uncertainty, the two fugitives exchanged a look of grim resolve. In that turbulent moment, with the haunting refrain of the gunshot still etched in their ears, Mara's voice broke through the clamor of the storm. "In the storm, we find our strength together," she whispered, her tone both defiant and resolute, a rallying cry that affirmed their newfound bond amidst impending peril. With hearts pounding and every sense alert to the threat lurking within the chaos, the fate of their escape now hung by a thread as the distant riders drew ever nearer. The storm, thick with sand and uncertainty, masked the true nature of their pursuers. Were they mere remnants of the corrupt posse, or had more determined, relentless force emerged from the tumult of ambition and revenge? The swirling sand of the open plains concealed the answers, leaving the future eerily suspended in the wind. And then, in the midst of that uncertainty, another sound, a subtle, almost imperceptible rumble, began to rise from the distant edge of the storm, heralding a new phase of danger yet to be revealed. The echo of the distant gunshot had barely faded into the relentless howl of the wind when chaos erupted around Silas and Mara. In the swirling dust of the open plains, as if summoned by betrayal itself, a volley of hired guns emerged from behind a low ridge of scrub and rock. Without warning, one of the shots found its mark. Silas cried out as a searing pain tore through his shoulder. His horse reared in alarm, and for a heart-stopping moment, the world seemed to tilt off its axis. Mara's eyes widened in terror as she saw the blood-darken Silas's duster. Instinctively, she spurred her own mount to slow the pair, her heart pounding with both fear and a fierce need to save him. In the midst of the ambush's chaos, hired men shouted orders and the sound of rapid gunfire filled the air. Silas clutched his wounded shoulder, his face contorted in pain and shock. The hired guns, faceless and relentless, advanced briefly before melting back into harsh terrain like specters seeking to finish what they had started. With his breathing ragged and his stern expression softened by agony, Silas's eyes met Mara's. A silent plea for help passed between them. In that moment, Mara's fear transformed into resolute courage. Taking charge of the situation, she dismounted swiftly and knelt beside him, With trembling yet determined fingers, she tore a strip from her kerchief and pressed it against a fresh wound. Using basic first aid she had learned long ago, she applied pressure and tried to staunch the bleeding. "Hold on, Silas," she murmured, voice wavering yet imbued with resolute calm. "We must get you to cover, and quick." The chaos around them seemed to recede into dim urgency as Mara urged her horse forward. "We must reach the valley," she said, glancing into the distance where an ink-black gap between rugged cliffs promised shelter and a trickling creek. The valley, hidden from main expanse by a line of weathered rocks and dense scrub, had long been whispered about as a refuge, a secret oasis where one could momentarily escape the harsh judgments of the frontier. Silas managed a pained nod, his pride yielding to necessity. "I'm with you, Mara," he whispered, his voice rough and edged with vulnerability. "In your strength, I find my redemption." His admission, soft as a prayer, stirred something deep within her. With the ambush still echoing in her ears, Mara spurred her horse onward as Silas gripped the reins of his steed, pain etching every determined line of his face. The two riders navigated through uneven terrain, weaving between clumps of scrub and splintered boulders. Every step was a testament to survival, a battle against both man and nature that raged on the unforgiving plains. Mara's mind sharpened with focus as she scanned the barren landscape. Every shifting shadow, every muffled sound to the high, arid air became a potential warning. The hired guns had vanished into the distance, but uncertainty curled around her like the desert wind. Minutes stretched into an eternity as they pressed on to the rugged terrain. The distant cry of an injured animal, the hissing of wind over scalded rocks, and the quiet, steady drip of blood mixed with sweat created a disconcerting symphony for their escape. Every so often, Mara would glance back at Silas, who fought through pain as he relied on her guidance. With each labored breath, he exuded a quiet fortitude, even as his face betrayed the agony of his wound. At last, after what felt like hours but was likely far less, the pair reached the brink of the hidden valley. Here, the earth softened from the relentless parch of the plains to a more forgiving dust, and a trickling creek cut its way through a narrow depression between towering, ancient cliffs. The valley was a sanctuary of sorts, a place where the air was cooler and the clamor of violence could be momentarily left behind. Mara eased her horse to a stop at the entrance, and together they dismounted. Silas leaned heavily against a large, weathered rock, and Mara knelt beside him once more. With careful hands, she removed her makeshift bandage to assess the injury more closely. The wound, though deep and still bleeding, appeared stable enough for the moment. The sound of the creek, soft and constant, lulled the unnatural urgency of the escape into a tentative calm. In that serene pocket of the frontier, Mara and Silas found a chance to recover. As Mara began to clean and dress the wound with water from the cool creek, Silas's eyes wandered over the peaceful valley. For the first time that day, he allowed the mask of the fearsome gunslinger to slip, revealing a glimpse of the man burdened by past failures and heartbreak. "I have seen many endings in these barren lands," he said, his voice low and reflective as he studied his own arm. "I once failed to save someone precious to me. That regret, it drove me to live as I do now. But today, I am lucky to have you by my side." The vulnerability in his tone, so rarely offered to another, resonated deeply with Mara. Moved by his admission, Mara offered a small, resolute smile. "We all bear wounds that run deeper than the skin," she replied softly, wrapping the bandage around his shoulder with a steady hand. "And sometimes it is in tending to those wounds that we learn our true strength." Her words, plain and earnest, seemed to forge a silent bond between them. For a few precious moments, with the gentle gurgle of the creek as their only witness, they allowed themselves to feel the warmth of connection, a bond formed in the crucible of violence and tempered by shared pain. As the valley offered a brief respite from the immediate danger, Mara and Silas took the time to plan their next move. Mara, whose eyes had grown steadier through the ordeal, surveyed the valley's edge, its rugged cliffs and shadow-dappled slopes a promise of temporary concealment. "We must be cautious," she said in a hushed tone, her gaze rising to meet Silas's. Our refuge here is not forever. The hired guns, or worse, might still be hunting us." Silas nodded, his expression dark with grim determination. That gunshot was but a harbinger of the storm yet to come. Here, in this valley, we may gather strength, but we must remain vigilant." The breeze stirred the sparse needles of desert scrub, and distant echoes reminded them that the frontier was never truly asleep. Between bandaging wounds and sharing quiet words, their conversation turned to dreams of a future unfettered by the sins of the past. Mara recounted her early days before the corrupt rancher had shattered her world. In a voice soft as the desert twilight, she spoke of fields that once flourished under her family's care, of laughter that had once filled her childhood, and of the cruel betrayal that left her scarred both in body and spirit. Silas listened, his eyes reflecting the flickering light of that newfound hope. "Your pain has not defined you," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "Instead, it has shaped you into a woman of courage. In your strength, I find my redemption." His words, laden with sincerity and aching resolve, resonated deeply with Mara, lighting a spark of determination within her soul. Just as a fragile peace settled over the valley, a subtle shift in the air sent a chill down Mara's spine. From the shadowed edge of the valley, where the ancient cliffs merged with the gathering dusk, came the sound of soft, measured footsteps, an ominous, almost imperceptible tread that betrayed the approach of new danger. Mara's heart pounded once more, and she exchanged a sharp glance with Silas. Their moment of reprieve was over. The quiet murmur of the creek and the soft rustle of desert brush were suddenly pierced by the unmistakable sound of boots stepping cautiously over stone and sand. In that charged moment, as the darkness grew deeper around the valley's fringes, a low murmur of voices drifted through the heavy air, a threat emerging from the shadows. Silas, his face pale despite his efforts, slowly rose and seized his pistol, his eyes scanning the dim boundary, where safety met uncertainty. Mara stepped forward beside him, her earlier calm sharpening into determined resolve. "They are coming," she whispered, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. "We have no choice but to confront what must be done." Her tone was a blend of fear and defiance, and in that moment, she was no longer the broken soul of the past, but a leader forged in adversity. As the sound of approaching footsteps grew clearer, a cadence of impending doom, the valley, once a sanctuary of gentle waters and whispered promises, transformed into a stage for the next battle. Shadows lengthened along the rugged walls, and the chill of the coming night mingled with the heat of unspent rage. Silas and Mara stood together, united by necessity and a bond that had been etched in blood and hope. And then, without warning, a guttural sound of command echoed from the darkening edge of the valley, a signal that the enemy had fully arrived. Before they could react further, the first of the shadowy figures emerged from behind a clump of scrub along the valley's border, their identities obscured by low light and shifting shapes. In that breathless moment, with hearts pounding and every sense straining in the gathering darkness, the fate of their fragile respite hung in the balance. The valley's fragile peace shattered as the shadowy figures emerged from behind the rocky outcroppings. With the last vestiges of the conflict still echoing in their ears, Silas and Mara braced themselves for the final confrontation. The hired guns, their faces hidden beneath worn-brimmed hats and chins, set in grim determination, advanced cautiously along a narrow pathway, cutting through the valley's rugged floor. Their boots churned the dried sand, and the distant murmur of their voices melded with the sound of the trickling creek that wound its way through the valley. Despite Silas's earlier wound and the constant throb of pain in his shoulder, his eyes burned with steadfast resolve. Mara, standing tall beside him with a calm that belied the storm of emotions inside, clenched her jaw and gripping the handle of the pistol at her hip. A tense silence fell as the hired guns closed in. One of them, taller than the rest and with a scar running down his cheek, raised his revolver with deliberate slowness. Silas, his gaze locked on the advancing foe, muttered, "This ends now." In an instant, the valley was filled with a staccato report of gunfire. Despite his injury, Silas moved with a precision born of years on the frontier. Each shot he fired echoed across the valley walls, his bullets finding targets with surgical accuracy. Meanwhile, Mara, her heart pounding in tandem with every resounding crack, darted forward to distract the enemy. With swift, deliberate movements, she hurled a rock off a nearby boulder toward one of the flank, drawing the attention of two of the men who veered off course. Her distraction gave Silas just enough time to reposition behind a cluster of sparse scrub, where he could gather his remaining strength. The hired guns, disoriented by Mara's audacity, exchanged confused looks as they attempted to regroup. Mara, seizing the initiative, called out sharply, "You'll never break our resolve." Her words, defiant and ringing with conviction, were carried by the wind, stirring a fierce determination within both of them. The firefight waged on for long minutes that felt like hours. Silas's shots, though fewer now due to pain in his shoulder, were relentless, each fire with a deep-seated desperation to protect the woman who had revived his long-buried humanity. The hired guns, realizing the futility of their assault against a duo united by hardships and bound by genuine care, began to falter. Their advance slowed, and soon one by one they retreated into the dust-mottled distance, leaving behind only the echo of their defeat. As the last of the pursuers vanished, a heavy silence fell over the valley once more. With the immediate threat diminishing, Mara hurried to Silas's side. She knelt and gently eased his arm, her fingers trembling as she inspected the makeshift bandage she had secured earlier. Drawing water from the clear, trickling creek, she carefully dabbed the wound with a clean cloth until the bleeding subsided. Silas winced as he allowed her tender ministrations, but in his eyes shone gratitude and something softer than the hardened demeanor of the gunslinger he was known to be. "You saved me," he murmured with a rough, choked emotion. Mara's gaze softened as she replied, "We saved each other. I couldn't let you perish when you gave me hope." Exhausted but relieved, the pair shared a quiet moment of recovery amid the valley's embrace. The gentle murmur of the creek and the cool shade provided by rugged cliffs fostered an atmosphere of fragile renewal. Silas, leaning back against a weathered granite outcrop, touched Mara's hand lightly. "Some bonds are forged in the dust of survival," he said, his voice low and earnest, a testament to the journey they had endured. Mara smiled faintly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears and newfound determination. It was a moment of shared vulnerability that sealed their growing partnership, their eyes conveying silent promises of a future built upon this very resilience. After allowing themselves a brief reprieve to gather strength and tend to their wounds, Silas and Mara knew their escape was not yet over. The valley, though a temporary sanctuary, could not shelter them from the harsh realities of the frontier forever. The bloodshed of the confrontation had drawn unwanted attention, and the hired gun's stubborn retreat did not guarantee they would not return with reinforcements. Determined to leave the immediate danger behind and to find a more stable base from which to rebuild their lives, the duo set out from the valley in earnest. Their journey took them through rugged trails winding among scrubland and rocky outcrops until they reached a modest trading post nestled in the embrace of a wide, dusty basin. The trading post, with its weathered wooden sign swinging gently in the warm afternoon breeze, offered a glimpse of frontier civic life, a hub of commerce, conversation, and community that had weathered its own share of adversity. Here, travelers met, goods were exchanged, and news of distant places traveled on the tongues of seasoned riders. For Mara and Silas, the place represented a chance to lay down roots, to start anew after months or perhaps years, defined by flight and fear. As they approached the trading post, the townsfolk watched with cautious curiosity. It was well known that Silas Crowe, despite his notorious reputation, had life-saving prowess and a heart that, beneath layers of hardship, yearned for redemption. Mara, too, her scarred visage now part of a powerful narrative of survival and grace, inspired whispers of admiration. Deputy Hank, his earlier hardness now softened by remorse and duty to justice, was among those who greeted them. With quiet dignity, he nodded his acknowledgement, a silent acceptance of redemption and change in his community. Settling into this new refuge, Silas and Mara began to reforge their lives. Silas, though still nursing the wound that would serve as a lasting reminder of the battle, agreed to work at the trading post. His strength and precision found a new outlet in overseeing the movement of goods and participating in the occasional duel of wits and gun touch that characterized frontier commerce. Mara, meanwhile, discovered that she had a nimbleness not only in survival but in trade as well. She quickly learned to barter, to negotiate, and soon became known for her fair dealings and unfaltering integrity. Their combined efforts fostered a quiet prosperity, transforming their shared trauma into the foundation of a promising future. Yet even as the trading post buzzed with the soft hum of new beginnings, a quiet moment of introspection awaited Mara. While helping to restock supplies, she discovered an old envelope tucked beneath a crate near the weathered counter. The paper was stained by age, its edges fraying, and the faded ink bore a familiar signature in elegant cursive, her lost sister's name. With trembling fingers, Mara unfolded the letter and read the heartfelt words. "I have wandered far, but remain tethered to our shared past. Know that I am determined to find you, to reconcile the fragments of our lives and heal the wounds left unaddressed. Until then, remember that even in the darkest hour, hope remains." The letter stirred a mixture of bittersweet recollections and cautious anticipation. It was a promise of unresolved ties and potential reunion, a thread that would, perhaps one day, lead her back to the family she thought lost forever. That night, as the trading post settled into a gentle lull beneath a star-splattered sky, Mara and Silas found a moment of quiet contemplation together outside an open doorway. The cool night air carried with it the smell of smoke and the whispers of unspoken dreams. Silas, leaning on a makeshift cane crafted in part from the trials of the day, looked intently at Mara. "We have come far, and though our scars may never completely fade, they have guided us here, to a chance for redemption, a chance for new life." His voice was soft yet resolute, echoing the truth of their journey. Mara, her eyes reflecting both the sorrow of her past and the brightness of the future, replied, "In your strength, I have found my redemption." Their bond, forged in the dust of survival and tempered by the fire of their ordeals, seemed unbreakable. Even as hope and healing began to settle over their new lives at the trading post, an unsettling murmur stirred in the distance. From across the barren basin, a faint metallic clink and the distant sound of hoofbeats hinted at an approaching threat. Mara and Silas exchanged wary glances, their earlier triumph now tempered by the realization that danger, like the past, had not yet been entirely vanquished. The soft murmur of potential peril grew louder, its cadence merging with the nocturnal sounds of the frontier, leaving their fate once again hanging in a balance yet undecided. For now, however, they clung to the warmth of the trading post, the promise of family in Mara's letter, and the quiet hope that every bond forged in the dust of survival could lead to brighter days ahead. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment about what you do next, and subscribe for more Wild West tales.